Give everybody another minute. How are you guys doing today? You good?
Good.
Good, ready? We're excited to hear from you. Here they come. Lots of names that I know and have become very familiar with. Very excited. Everybody's coming to join us here. Give it another minute. Alrighty, let's get started. I'm Christy and I am the Executive Director for SSA. Welcome to our November Avoiding Escheatment webinar. Thanks for joining us. We're really happy that you are here with us today. We get to hear from Cindy Neasley from Georgeson and Melissa Steinrock from Scripta. The question and answer feature is available for everybody today. If you want to go ahead and throw any questions that you have for the presenters in there, and we'll be answering them as we move through the presentation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa and Cindy.
Christy, thanks so much. And we just wanted to let everybody know that this presentation is provided purely for educational purposes. The contents do not constitute legal advice, and the opinions expressed are those of the presenters and do not represent the opinions of the Shareholders Services Association, nor any of its member organizations. So I'll turn it to Melissa to run us through the agenda.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, so before we dive in, just wanted to take a look at the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to, what you all came for, get to the strategies and tips for preventing escheatment. But before we do that, we're going to set out a little bit of the why that is an important goal, and when that's an important goal. What are the different criteria that can lead us into a situation where we need to escheat? And then the meat of this, don't all drop off the webinar once I reveal the real crux here, which is the biggest key to avoiding escheatment, establishing contact. And finally talk about some of the industry initiatives that are going on currently to help either change standards, reach more shareholders, or really just make sure that everybody out there is aware of what can happen to their property. So with that, we can start diving right in. In order to talk about why it's important to avoid escheatment, we have to understand what escheatment is and what the different constituencies are that are involved in this process. So generally speaking, obviously escheatment is the term for the process by which lost or unclaimed property is turned over to the custody of the state. That's generally speaking the state of the address of record of the owner of the property. I think we should be clear, although we called this webinar Avoiding Escheatment, what we mean by avoiding in this situation is really that we avoid being in the situation where we are required to escheat. Not that we're looking for ways to get around the law, but more that we're looking for ways to avoid being put in the position where that law applies to us. So we want to stay in compliance, but also limit our exposure. So Cindy's going to dive into talking about why both issuers and shareholders may find it important to avoid escheatment. But before we get to that, I think it's also worth noting that there are some benefits to this process. And, what is the state's perspective as to why this exists in the first place? And so that really comes down to the state's viewing the entire structure of unclaimed property as consumer protection laws. They see this as a system whereby owners, if they really don't know the nature and the location and who is in control of their property, are going to be benefited by the state having custody of that and then being able to have one central place to go to reclaim property that they have lost contact on. And from a general public policy perspective, this concept that the state can make better use of the benefits of the collective lost property of individuals than maybe a private company can. And so that's the reason why this exists. But looking at that in a vacuum doesn't really explain everything. So Cindy, do you want to dive into the other side of that coin?
Yeah, thanks so much, Melissa. You're so right. There are many points of view on escheatment, and our audience today are mainly issuers, and I think the issuers have a dual view. One, of course, is to stay in compliance and do the right thing, adhere to the state requirements, and be in a position to defend if they're audited. But they also want to generally protect their shareholders and make sure that shareholders are not escheated prematurely or erroneously, or for the wrong reason, right? And as you mentioned, the concept of escheatment is really around, I think, back in its origin, to gather property into a consolidated place where, if people truly have lost track of their property, they know where to go to find it. And especially heirs who might not even know about the property, they can go to that sort of central repository and find sometimes their property that they didn't even know about. So that can be incredibly helpful. I think where a lot of us struggle with this, especially in the securities area, is when it's escheated and the person has not lost track of it, right? They know they have the property. They might even have a stock certificate that they're keeping in a safe deposit box. And they feel so comfortable with that notion that was prevalent for so many years of set it and forget it, right? Where they've invested, they've put it aside. They don't want to keep, buying and selling. They've bought it, they've set it aside like a nest egg. And they're not going to necessarily have a reason to reach out to the transfer agent or broker if they haven't moved or they have nothing to update. So that's where you get into trouble, where people, they do know about the property, but they're not staying in contact and showing interest that is required by various state laws. So that's a real challenge for issuers to balance those requirements. The states, with their emphasis more and more on escheating property that's just deemed inactive, and yet also protecting shareholders and alerting them to the need to stay in contact so that they don't have to escheat that property. Mm-hmm. Now, from the shareholders' standpoint, as we said, it could be a plus if they don't know about the property and they can, it's a great, exciting thing to find out that they're due property. But if they do know about it and it's been escheated maybe in the past, and there's been market gain and also corporate actions like dividends, stock splits, anything like that, we know that many states will sell that property upon receipt. And oftentimes people don't find out that their property's been escheated until they go to sell it. That's when they find out that, 5 years ago, it was escheated. And in the meantime, the stock has gone up in value and they're not entitled to that if the shares were sold. And the state is only going to remit what they received when they sold the property. So that's where it can be so painful. So we want to make sure that shareholders don't get a bad surprise, and that they retain the market growth and all of the benefits that they're expecting from share ownership. So a lot of sort of different points of view that are in play here. And, and as issuers, you're sort of in the middle of all that, trying to balance all of those concerns. All right, I think we go to anything you want to add to that, Melissa?
No, I think it's a really good point. It's these differing positions, right, that the states have on the one side versus the owners and the holders on the other that are creating the tension between, you know, let's call it overstreeting and delivering things to this custody of the state that maybe the owners does not want there because they're aware of it and they had a plan for it, versus understreeting and you having people who really don't know where their property is and are never going to be able to find their shares because they're not aware that they even own them. And so striking that balance is really, I think, should be the goal, but there are other considerations that maybe the state has too in driving some revenue that kind of underlie a little bit of it and kind of push that tension a little more to one side. So as we talk through that, we think it's important to understand what the criteria are that could lead you into a position where you're going to be required to escheat shares. And in general, there's really 4 criteria that either alone or in combination could be the factors that establish a trigger from which a dormancy period is going to run. So these are really the beginning of the process. One of these will then start a clock. It's going to vary by state, be 3 or 5 years from the date of the trigger, that then the property becomes presumed abandoned. If it is those number of years from the trigger as of the state established cutoff date, then it's due to be remitted in the next cycle. So the historical trigger, and it's something that we've seen a little bit of a move away from, although also a way to get back into with the 2016 revised Uniform Unclaimed Property Act. That's what we abbreviate as RUPA here in the slides if you guys are reading along. But that is the return mail standard. So under this standard, dormancy is triggered when you have a piece of first-class mail that is returned as undeliverable, either because the owner has moved or is deceased or whatever reason is no longer at the address of record. You find out that it's a bad address, and then the dormancy begins there. What the RUPA does, which we alluded to before, is it uses the return mail standard, but is a modernization because it takes into account the fact that a lot of shareholders today are not receiving first-class mail. They opt into electronic delivery of all of their statements and all of their communications, and then you're not triggering this dormancy period because there is no act of mail going out. So there will be no mail returned. I think there's also an idea that people don't, indicate return mail any longer if they're getting a prior residence mail as well in turnover of homes. And if the NCOA wasn't updated, then are you really going to even get a return mail? So the standard is, I think, by the industry still considered kind of the best standard to ensuring that you're not over-escheating, like we talked about previously, but it's something that, for practical reasons, isn't as useful maybe as it once was. So that's sort of the first piece of this. The next one we talk about is an inactivity standard. This is where dormancy will run based on the date of last contact. The concept of date of last contact is also incorporated across all of these other standards too, because as we said at the beginning, contact is king. So if you have contact occurring after any one of these other potential triggers, it will restart dormancy. So shareholder contact is one of the great things, but what qualifies as contact is going to differ by state. But we know that written contact will always be contact. And that, driving that act is really going to be your main goal through most of these efforts to avoid escheatment, right? Another trigger that you see is potentially an uncashed distribution. As of course more and more issues move to being in dividend reinvestment programs or are using automatic distribution via ACH, so that it's very rarely going to fail. It's going into another account. You're going to see combinations of uncashed distribution with another factor. So either an uncashed distribution and no activity in a linked account that is not in a dividend reinvestment program, or the earlier of an uncashed distribution or RPO, so that accounts that don't get mail to establish that RPO trigger are going to escheat off of an uncashed distribution. Those are the ways that this is still used in unclaimed property laws to trigger dormancy. And then the final one that just got added to this list because more and more states are adding it as a dormancy trigger is death of the owner. Now, there, as of now, is no state that has explicitly imposed a blanket obligation to search for owner death, but instead, there are a couple, 4, 5, now that require you to confirm death if you receive notice of an owner death. And then there's a lot of uncertainty in the industry, I think, right now about what constitutes contact if it occurs after the owner's death. Obviously, and the states will be quick to tell you a dead person can't make contact on their account. But an owner isn't defined only as that person. In all of the unclaimed property statutes, an owner includes anyone with a beneficial interest, equitable or beneficial interest in the property. So there are other individuals who have a right to that account, even once the owner, the registered owner, has died. There could even be named beneficiaries on the account. And there can be activities that these people take that are contact. So contact's still king. And Cynthia, do you have anything you want to add on the eligibility standards?
Yeah, Melissa, this death trigger is really interesting. And, Florida, Nevada, Oregon are kind of new to the party, but there's also Idaho, New York, Vermont to keep your eye on.
In Illinois.
Yeah, and Illinois. Yeah, exactly. And, I think what's interesting to me here about the introduction of this, and I consider it kind of a hidden headline to the news on the death provision, is that it's overlaid what I will call a bit of a carve out for dividend reinvestment or DRIP. So in other words, like just take Florida, for example, there was a provision that DRIP was considered contact. But what has happened is that provision in the law was overlaid with the death provision. And so the DRIP protection, if you will, has disappeared. And so you have a situation where an account might have gone along for a long time under DRIP, and maybe there's been no activity per se. In other words, everything's updated. Let's say, for example, it's a retired couple. They updated their address when they moved to Florida. It's been running under DRIP. It's possible that one of the participants passed away. But what's happened is that it was still considered active because it was reinvesting. What's happened now is that because that, and this is what's interesting, whether or not somebody passed away, the removal of the DRIP provision means that if there was no activity, that account is going to pop up as escheatable. And that's happening, right? That's happened with the fall. So you have it, and it's tricky for shareholders, right? Because they really have no notice of this. They think everything's fine and they've made no changes. And they've had it for maybe years where they haven't had to make contact and they have been safe, if you will. Now suddenly the rug is pulled out from under them and the property's escheated. And again, realize that unless they're monitoring this, they may not know. And even if they're receiving statements, remember, if someone gets a statement like a due diligence letter, right? They probably look similar. And if they're not opening that all the time, they just honestly set it aside to file later, they may not have even known that they received the due diligence letter. And then they may not even again realize that the property was escheated until they go to sell it. So that's really that's what we want to avoid. And I'll just make a comment here that, when people go to claim their shares from the state, and let's say the state has sold it, sometimes that could be a benefit to someone. If the price of that stock has gone down, you might be glad that the state sold it when they did, right? But it's subject to market volatility. And that's what we really want to avoid. And I think it's having respect for the shareholders' intent. They didn't intend to sell that, whether it was up or down. And so having, it sold without their, direction is really the thing that is, a little concerning perhaps about that. So again, I'll say that to me, the death provision, watch out for that, because the states that incorporated that have removed or eliminated, overlaid the DRIP provision as being contact. So watch out for that.
Yeah. Florida's prior law was, I believe, the earlier of an uncashed distribution or RPO, and they removed the RPO standard and went to straight inactivity and then added the death part. So yes, it used to be for a DRIP by default, since there wasn't a distribution to be unclaimed, we were waiting for RPO, right? Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So, what is our number one rule?
Contact. That is the key. As Melissa said, contact is king. So it's a matter of alerting your shareholders, educating them about the importance of establishing contact. So a lot of that is education, which we're going to touch on in the next slide. But you can take action on that from an issuer standpoint a lot of different ways. Things like putting notices on dividend checks, on your website, information about the importance of maintaining contact. Anytime you're addressing shareholders, it's always a good thing to remind them about the importance of maintaining contact. So you as the issuer have a mouthpiece to talk to your shareholders and educate them whenever possible. So that's a super important tool that you have. Also important is, to the extent possible, to link related accounts so that contact on one will propagate to the others. Sometimes that's not easy or perfect because someone may have multiple accounts under different registrations. With joint accounts, one might be under the Social Security of one spouse, another might be under a different spouse or the other spouse's Social Security number. So it's not always possible to perfectly link everything that's related to a person. But to the extent that we can, that's always helpful. And a lot of times a transfer agent can create that portfolio view, which is, again, super helpful. Of course, there's a lot of outreach mechanisms, the ones that are required by the state, obviously due diligence, but that's really late in the game, right? So you really don't want to wait for that one last letter. What you want to do is have some kind of outreach that's happening before you're under the gun and in that time crunch of right before escheatment. Many issuers still send out some physical mailings, which is good, or electronic mailing, but we are moving, as Melissa said, it's moving more toward electronic communication. And so you've got to be mindful of all of those things. One thing that I think is interesting is, in fact, Connecticut recently lengthened the period of due diligence to 180 days, which is pretty long. And you might think, and I think the motivation here might have been to give shareholders or just owners in general more time to respond. But I think this can be counterintuitive, because think about this. If you get a letter that says you have 180 days to respond, it's very likely that you may set that aside because you don't have to do it right away, right? And if you set it aside, you may forget about it. So I wonder if some of those may hurt more than they help. And I'll share something with you. We did a little pilot on this recently where we had it was a small population, but these were folks who were about to be escheated. They had received the due diligence letter. They had been, some of them, in an asset reunification program. So they had been reached out to for sure, but they had still done nothing. And this is the challenge. Why do people refuse to act? Well, they may never open the mail, so they don't even know. They may think, I don't need to respond because I haven't moved. Everyone knows where I am. I'm not lost. So they don't think they need to respond. But for whatever reason, they haven't responded. So we tried something a little different with this small group. What we did is we sent them, instead of sending them the classic, business size envelope, which looks, less exciting or interesting to open, we sent them a large UPS or FedEx sized envelope, right? Which is a little more expensive, but it's almost irresistible. People want to open those, right? It's really hard to set one of those aside and not open it. So that was the first thing. The other thing was, because we were so close to the deadline, we gave them a really urgent message, right? It was, you need to respond within 14 days or your property will be turned over to the state. So it was extremely urgent message. And there was also no charge. So it was not part of an asset reunification program. There was no charge to them. And we gave them a clear instruction. It was like, call this number. You need to call immediately. In fact, we said that. We said, call immediately. And the response rate on that was 75%, which is higher than any other means that I'm aware of getting a response. And again, these were people who had received other things and hadn't acted. So I think that's something that to me is a learning, and it's how do we do the most effective outreach. Now, I don't know if we're seeing our slides. I'm not seeing them anymore.
Did they disappear?
I think so.
Trouble. I think I got kicked out and back in. But yeah, let's keep talking.
But I think we can keep going. And
yeah, that was a great overview of the outreach. Do you find that overcoming some skepticism is also a part of the issue in trying to get owners to reestablish contact after your outreach?
Well, I think that's a great point, Melissa, and it's a valid thing too, right? For people, I think we're all schooled on, don't click on links that you're not expecting. Don't respond to things that you think might be some kind of an inappropriate outreach, right? So I think, an important thing for these due diligence letters is that they are on letterhead, that they are from a trusted source. And obviously the best guidance for folks, if they do have a concern about something, and we know that outreach from phishing scams and all different types of outreach are becoming better and better in terms of mimicking the trusted source, is for the person to reach out directly to their trusted source, either the issuer or the transfer agent, if they know who that is. And then they are avoiding perhaps reacting to something that's not from that trusted source. So that's what is always good guidance for anybody. If you have a concern, reach out directly to the trusted source. But another thing here we talked about is maintaining your books and records. And, if you're an issuer and you have a transfer agent, they will maintain the records of shareholders reaching out directly to the transfer agent. But here's something to watch out for, is that sometimes shareholders will reach out directly to the issuer. They may call you or, reach out by email. As the issuer, you really have a responsibility to track those contacts and make sure that they are updated on the records of the transfer agent, because otherwise, when escheatment occurs, that contact, if it's not there, it will not prevent the escheatment from happening. And another one, just to be alert to, is sometimes an issuer will use a proxy solicitor that is not the same as the transfer agent. And when that happens, remember, voting a proxy is showing interest in your property. It is contact. But when that data is collected by a different party, you as issuer need to make sure that you request that file and make sure it's updated again on the record of the transfer agent, so that when the escheatment analysis is done, that contact can be factored in and protect those shareholders from having their property escheated. So just be alert to that. That's really, really important, because we encourage people to vote their proxy, right? But if they do, and then they still have their property escheated, they may come back to you as the issuer and say, wait a darn minute, why was my property escheated? And then you as the issuer have risk there. So you don't want that to happen. You want to protect yourself and the shareholder against that occurring.
I think that's a really important point, and it might speak to. So I was, and I think this may be how we dropped our slides to begin with. I was trying to take a look at the questions that were in the chat, but it looks like one of those questions about the auditor's push to basically remove the benefits of an RPO standard for all accounts that are on fully e-delivery. But interestingly, those proxy solicitations may not be on e-delivery, and there are still mailings going. They're just from a different vendor, and that's really important and a great thing to point out back to these auditors who are insisting that you're not sending mail, so the mail can't return. There are other sources which are going through, and if we are maintaining our complete books and records and having that information in here, we can easily point to it really quickly at the last time a mailing went out.
Yeah. I see another question up here on the chat. It says, are the transfer agents doing anything proactively to get in front of this, like offering an add-on service to reach out to dormant shareholders if there has been no activity within a certain period of time? And then same question for deceased shareholders. Is anything being done to locate beneficiaries or heirs? And this leads us straight into this final bullet point on here of cleanup programs, right? So many transfer agents will have called either cleanup programs or asset reunification programs that will do more outreach and search to find the correct or updated address, or in the case of a deceased holder, find the heirs and reach out to them and encourage them to update their records and establish contact. So those kind of programs are generally available. I think that in many cases, those are, shareholder paid. And so that's a great tool, but it doesn't necessarily cover the whole ground. So again, what we found is that there may need to be an additional outreach by issuers if they want to go the extra mile, right? And sometimes there's going to be some cost to that if they want to do that. And what we've encouraged people to do is look at your demographic, right? And where your shareholders are located. Are they in some of these states that have a more a more aggressive approach to escheating property? Maybe that's where you target your outreach to, and you spend those dollars where you think they will be the most effective and where they're the most needed. You may look at the value. You may say, well, I'm going to target a certain population above a certain threshold. It really depends on your risk analysis, what you're comfortable with, how much you're willing to invest in this. And I would suggest, you want to utilize a whole variety of tools, right? Not just one, because all of these can be effective, but none of them are 100% effective, right? So the more tools you can use, the more outreach, the more education, the more shareholder paid, issuer paid, use a suite of services that are tailored and customized for you and for your particular situation. I think that's usually the most effective.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There are obviously many ways to do this, and it's all about balancing your best combination of risk and reward, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. Okay.
So
Looks like we've got another question. Should we take another question here, Melissa?
yeah, let's do that.
It says, I'll read it here. And maybe it says, some state laws have knowledge of death in their law. Are the search results from the SEC 1780-17 searches, where the search vendor has identified a shareholder potentially deceased, considered knowledge of death? So are the transfer agents performing systems enhancements in order to capture the knowledge of death in order, what happened here?
In order
to leverage the knowledge of death in their escheatment analysis. Okay.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think there's a couple of different terms that the states are using. Knowledge of death is one of them, and knowledge of death, I believe, is Nevada's term. There's also confirmation of death, and then others that just use date of death. Knowledge of death, I think, by the way Nevada has defined it, ends up being something very similar to confirmation of death. So those results from the 1780-17 search, if they're the first time you're getting back these shareholders are deceased and can therefore be excluded from your search, I'd say that's probably an indication of death. And the statutes do talk about that, because they talk about, if you receive an indication of death in the course of regular business activities, which I guess, performing your 1780-17 search obligations, or preparing to perform them by determining who can be searched, or who's eligible for search, would be a part of that. So I think it's the first step. It's the indication of death, and then it would start the clock you have, which in most states that have this structure is going to be 90 days. Start that 90-day clock for you to confirm the indication of death. And that's a business decision as to what constitutes confirmation. The states leave that very open. Is it a phone call with the surviving spouse, or do you require receipt of a death certificate? When do you have your confirmation of death? Is something that's kind of open-ended. From a fraud prevention perspective, I think a lot of instances you may want to consider requiring that death certificate, but maybe there's some combination of other indicia that could serve as the confirmation if you haven't heard from anybody who can get you a death certificate, because that's the other thing, right? If there's no direct relative who's surviving, who's aware of these shares, then there's nobody to give you a death certificate, and that's exactly the instance in which the state would want this property.
Yeah. And I'll add too, part of the question here was, are transfer agents making these updates? And this was a question that was asked at the annual meeting of the SSA as well. And I can say that, our Georgia Citizens affiliate ComputerShare is fully updated in terms of their system capabilities to track this and factor it in for the states as required. And I believe that the other large transfer agents are also updated. I don't want to speak for them, but I believe at the meeting, it was indicated that they are up to date. So I think you can feel comfortable that those, some of the larger transfer agents are fully aware and have updated their systems accordingly.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. We've got another question here. Third-party auditors are focusing on owners who are signed up for delivery for all communications and challenging the use of RPO, the result. What proactive measures should issuers consider implementing with their transfer agents to get in front of all these changes?
Yeah, so that's the one that I had given a cursory review of, and I think it a good one piece of that would be ensuring that other vendors who are actually sending mail the results of their mailings are being communicated to your transfer agent, so that their records for last successful mailing and reflect maybe the proxy that was sent out, or the, who knows, whatever else, postcard, whatever you did.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's right. I'm sorry. I see we have there were three questions, and I think we've dealt with all of those.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the things that are being done in the industry. One is the SEC initiative, and I think the idea here is in response to what's happened. I think most of us are familiar with 1780-17, right? This is the requirement for transfer agents and brokers to reach out to unresponsive payees for checks and for lost security holders for those who have a bad address or a return from post office, RPO. And in the case of the bad address, to search for a better address and reach out to try to reunite those people, right? And to do it for free mailings, right? So these would be at no charge to the shareholder, right? To do 2 free searches and mailings. Now, the issue here is, as we've moved more toward the inactivity standard, you can have someone who's inactive and therefore on the road to escheatment, but doesn't have a bad address, right? Their address may be fine, and they wouldn't necessarily ever trigger the lost security holder search. And so the concern was, well, gosh, these folks are not getting the benefit of those 2 free outreaches. They're just going straight to due diligence and out the door, right? So the idea was, well, when the SEC drafted that, the inactivity standard was not a norm. It was mainly RPO. It was mainly the loss standard. So the thought was, well, gee, should we alert them and say, maybe you should redraft or come up with something new and address this population of people that are being escheated? And we know a lot of property is being escheated under the inactivity rule as opposed to the loss rule. So that's something I know has been done. Outreach to the SEC to say, hey, you ought to take a look at this and see what you might want to do to address that, which is fine. The only caution I would add here is that whenever you reach out to a regulator, you don't really know what they may do with that, right? And if they implement something, it may not be something that you're real happy with, and then you're going to be stuck with it. So sometimes, be careful what you wish for, right? And I would say that my guess, this is just my thought about it, is that the most obvious thing for the SEC to do would be to say, well, you should do a mailing or an outreach to anybody who's inactive before they reach the due diligence phase, right? But remember, that cost is going to go ultimately to issuers, right? That will have to pay for that. And it'll be probably across the board. It won't necessarily be tailored to your risk profile and your demographic. And it's a cost that's going to continue for the foreseeable future, right? So you'd be taking on an ongoing cost that's being dictated by someone else, not yourselves. So I just think that's something to keep in mind as these initiatives are brought forward. There's good motivation and there's good ideas. It's just sometimes just be aware of how that might play out and make sure you're comfortable with the result.
Yeah, and I think there's also the idea that if it's just adding more of the same, an additional first class mailing, is that really going to move the needle very far? You already have your due diligence mailing going out. You may already have an inactivity mailing going out because well, RUPA's RPO, but they also are getting an inactivity mailing before to even create the RPO in the first place, right? So
Yeah.
you rely on it. So then there's still extra mailings that are occurring for the RPO population because they got their inactivity mailing and then that RPO and then they got their search and then they got another mailing and then they got their due diligence mailing.
Exactly.
And yeah.
Yeah.
So there's an idea that maybe it's not necessarily achieving all that much by adding a requirement of another one of the same mailing to the same address to the same.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, another initiative is our friends over at ICI, I think would like to lobby for a federal law to get some consistency across the states, which I think we would all love to have more consistency. That would make it easier for everybody. And the ICI has been trying to collect stories about, people who had a result from escheatment that maybe was not the best, and that might motivate lawmakers to put something in place to hold to the law standard, as we've talked about. I think it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a difficult task to get that kind of thing through Congress, and certainly not a simple matter to implement that, but a good idea. I just think that's a tough one to implement.
Definitely. I was trying to think through if they had a higher or lower likelihood under incoming Congress to be effective with this. I'm like, well, so any initiative that's going to take some power away from the states is probably not going to be that attractive. There's not going to be a large appetite for that in the incoming Congress. But then by contrast, it's also something that is very individual rights oriented. So you've got people who are shareholders who are going to be able to retain their property rather than it going to a state agency, which is kind of not something that is going to be popular, I guess. So I couldn't figure out a way to come down on it if they're more or less likely to be successful.
Yeah, well, it's ongoing, and look, we'll see where that goes. And you're right.
Yeah, And
No,
worth
no.
mentioning on this call, because if any of the audience members, issuers have these kinds of stories of their shareholders that they're aware of who, they did the right thing and instituted it based on the state law, but was a outcome that really was detrimental to a shareholder, please share those stories if you can, so that the ICI can use them for this effort, because we do all want uniformity. Let's be honest about that. And I think what their goal is some kind of a floor, right? A federal floor that no state law on the escheatment of securities could have a standard that would require escheatment without RPO, right? Is that, I think, the objective.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think most of us would agree with and think that would be a great thing to have. That sort of base level
Yeah.
standard would be good, which obviously we thought we were maybe getting with the new Uniform Act, but
Yeah.
it has not been uniformly implemented. Yeah. So the third item here is, again, shareholder education, right? I've come around in my thinking to the fact, I think the fact that at the end of the day, the best thing would be if we had a educated public that knew the importance of contact and knew what to do and did it. And then you would not have to worry about so many accounts and so much property being escheated to the states, because people would be staying in contact. They would keep their address updated. They would, on an annual basis, go in and call or write or update something, keep their beneficiary updated, vote their proxy, take some action that shows interest in their property. And this applies not just to shares of stock and dividend checks, but their bank accounts and their insurance policies and all of their financial assets, right? I mean, this whole escheatment issue is so broad, and it applies really to anybody who has a financial asset, right? So, I think all of us have taken action at various times to try to educate, and I don't know, I've written articles and done this and that, but in this age, it seems like everybody learns from video. We decided to create a little video series for the general public, using plain language, no lingo, no special terms that sound funny, like escheatment or dormancy or due diligence, and explain to people in really easy to understand terms why it's important, what do they have to do, and what may happen if they don't. So we have 8 videos, and one of them is a case study, right? Where a colleague of mine, she tells what happened to her family. And we think that's really powerful, right? Because it shows, like, gosh, they didn't update their address, and so the property was escheated and sold. They didn't realize for years and years till they went to sell the shares, they were gone. And then they were disappointed because they didn't have the value they thought they did, right? So we have this little video series out there. It's designed for the general public. I think the SSA will be posting that in the coming weeks, and Christy will let you know how to find that. Feel free to reach out to me. We want to make this link available to everybody. It's a public service, and it's my dream is that it would be shared so widely that everybody would understand how to protect their financial assets and do that. So that's my hope, and so we share that freely. We ask anyone is free to use our link and post that, share it with friends, family, colleagues, neighbors, anyone who that you would like to help. And so on that note, I think do we have any other questions, Christy?
I don't see any more. If anybody has anything else they want to throw in the chat here quick for us, we can wait a minute and see if anything pops up.
I will mention I've watched the video series that Cindy was referring referring to, and they do a great job really explaining how important it is for individual shareholders to be proactive about their property. And it's unfortunate that they have to, but it's a great reminder to focus on the part that's in our control, which is making sure that we get the word out. Right? We can't change the state laws. We can try, we can't change them, but we can certainly make sure that the people who need to know what they need to do to prevent a bad outcome. Right? And that's really commendable. And you mentioned, Christy, that link that Cindy referred to is going to be on the SSA website after the call. We don't know exactly where it's at, but it'll be up there.
We'll let everybody know where it ends up landing on the website.
Yeah. Well,
all right. Well,
thanks so much for Melissa. I appreciate your kind words there. And Christy, thank you so much to the SSA. I think Melissa and I both really appreciate this opportunity to share some ideas and information that hopefully is useful to the SSA membership. So thank you for this opportunity. We love doing it and really glad to answer any questions too. I'm sure offline, Melissa and I are both available and happy to take any emails if anyone has any other questions that come up later.
You guys are stealing all my thunder. I was just about to say it. I don't see any more questions. So if anybody does,
that was the closing statement.
If anybody wants to send me an email, I can get you guys in touch with Melissa or Cindy. But like I said, I don't see any other questions, so I can let you guys know if we get anything through email. And
all right.
Thank you everybody for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed the session, and seriously, a big thank you, Cindy and Melissa, for being here with us. We really appreciate it. I did want to mention really quick that we do have the December regional event coming up, and that is going to be at the Verizon headquarters in New Jersey. The registration page is up on the SSA website, so feel free to go out and register today. We are offering an in-person and a virtual ticket for that, so we will take you however you want to come and see us, whether that is in person or online. So I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and thanks again.
All righty.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.